Okay. Cool. Well, we are live. How are you doing today, Julian?
I'm doing all right. Did you invite the other guests?
Yeah, I've invited them.
Okay.
Um, for those just joining us, um, the way that you get onto the Google Hangout is you click the play button on your Google Plus page that has the event hosted on it. Um, it's the window that's sort of faded like a matte kind of blur. You just hit play. So it looks like Mike is joining us soon, as well as some of our exclusive Patreon members. Thank you again for supporting Sequart. It's really an honor to be able to do this with you all, as well as with you, Julian, who wrote, I believe, our first book, "Improving the Foundations," for the company. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was our first book, and it was published in 2005, and it was in print prior to the DVD being released. So I'm not sure that had ever been done before, but I thought it was something cool to do using the technology that existed at the time, which allowed you to get a book into print faster. Um, so I thought that was fun to do. It was a good way to spend the summer for me. And we actually had a book on Batman Begins out before the DVD. So that was the
Okay.
first edition. And I think now we're on the revised second edition.
And has the reception for that book been generally received as fairly positive, as sort of one of the kind of cutting edge, one of the first of its kind of books where you would take a piece of popular culture, like a film or a work of art that isn't necessarily related to comic books as far as the industry goes, but you're taking this work of art and then you're dissecting it and analyzing it from a critical perspective to try to see what kind of cogs and wheels are going into this project, how the source material has influenced, in this case, Christopher Nolan's final project. Do you feel that this book was sort of on the cutting edge as far as the first of its kind to kind of take this critical analysis in this way?
Uh, no, I don't. I'd like to be able to say, sure, yeah, I was cutting edge, but um, I grew up reading books about films and books analyzing films, and in fact, I was, even though my book on Batman Begins was longer, I was very influenced by the BFI Film Classic series, which has had a number of important authors contribute to it. Um, uh, Several people who I respect as intellectuals and professors have contributed to it. Will Brooker wrote the one on Star Wars. Um, and even though I hadn't read that, I had read several other ones, and they're short. They're like 100 pages or less, but they were focused only on one movie. And I thought this was a really cool way of making analysis, in that case of movies, accessible to the general public because they were very readable. They were fun to read. And so I would buy them and sort of like read them on buses or in cafes. That was a great example of analysis that was written for a general audience, much like Sequart was doing. And I was reading a lot of those at the time, and I thought, well, Sequart can do this. And at the time, it really didn't occur to me that there was necessarily for book length analysis of comics. I mean, we were doing book length analysis of comics on the website, but there were only a couple books written analyzing comics, and So it made sense that Batman Begins was the first one, because what I was really doing was analyzing the comics. And, basically, because I have a film studies background, I mean, it let me analyze the movie, but I was always coming back to what were the comics that inspired it. And if you look at that movie, it's very, very carefully pulling from, 60 years of Batman stuff and weaving it all together into a 3-act structure, which is what a movie has to do, which is why it's very hard to adapt a single comic's work. And so in order to analyze the movie, I was able to really pull in, all this stuff, not only about Year One, and Frank Miller's Year One, and different versions of Batman's origins, but also all this stuff about Ra's al Ghul and how he had changed over the years, and all this stuff about Scarecrow, and all the stuff about No Man's Land, and sort of the way Gotham is laid out in that movie. It's very Chicago. Even the idea of the Narrows, that came from No Man's Land. And so there are all these bits and pieces that come from all these different works over 60 years and are kind of fused together. And part of that fusing takes liberties and changes things. So I think that, there were precedents for certainly talking about comics and popular culture, but I sort of used this idea as a way of talking about comics without daring to do this, 250-page book just about Batman comics. Which there were a couple books like that before, but that was sort of uncharted territory. And then because of that book, Improving the Foundations, we went on to do other books that were really just pure comic stuff, as well as books about other movies.
So I see a few more people have just joined us. So for those of you who just joined us, I'm speaking with Dr. Julian Darius on his essay anthology, Improving the Foundations, in which we take a look, as Sequart takes a look at the Batman Begins film, sort of takes it apart and looks at the cogs and wheels of the project that Christopher Nolan tried to tackle, where he tried to renew the Batman mythology, but using some of these interesting comic book dynamics that were sort of adapted from large works of comics over the past history of Batman comics up to that time. And you were just discussing sort of how there's these different specific comic book arcs that went into the making of this Batman film. Were there any particular comic book arcs that you felt were very intentionally chosen, in that Christopher Nolan is trying to create this kind of cultural milieu that reflects today, and then sort of picks particular aspects of the comics that he's kind of pulling these resources from? Do you feel that there are any particular comic choices that were very prudent in these films?
Yeah, I think one thing that surprises people is that we all kind of expected Batman Begins to essentially be an adaptation of Batman Year One. And, again, we're talking 2005, and, all of us Batman fans and comics fans thought, great, we've known Batman Year One rocks and is a realistic Batman. We've known this forever. Actually, almost 20 years at that point. And we haven't really seen this on film. So we were kind of expecting that to be the movie. And, in fact, that was early versions of what became Batman Begins were actually an adaptation of Batman Year One. That was some iterations of, the concept. Again, I think one thing that's remarkable is how little it really owes to Batman Year One. So, if you think about it, Batman Year One has really no main villain besides, the Roman, this gangster. And he gets a scar from Catwoman during the graphic novel. But Catwoman is a main villain, and the Roman is a mobster, and it doesn't really hang together as a superhero movie. I mean, you couldn't really adapt that and say, here's the Roman. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, Batman's becoming Batman, but he's in the milieu of Chinatown. It's not really a superhero movie. So I think what David Goyer, the screenwriter who knows comics, and worked with Nolan to develop the sort of 3-act structure, what he did, which I think was quite brilliant, was not only work Scarecrow into the whole Arkham thing, but work Ra's al Ghul in as the mentor, right? And so working Ra's al Ghul into the mentor stuff lets the whole first act basically be Batman's origin, right? So, you have all the mentor stuff of him traveling the world, stuff we've never seen on film before, and Ra's al Ghul is obviously the main mentor, the final mentor there. So that allows you to bring back Ra's al Ghul for the third act as the, the real Ra's al Ghul, as the main villain, right? So it ties the movie together. Because one of the problems is in shooting a movie, if you want to have the first act be basically his training, and you want to have the third act be your, climactic superhero fight in Gotham, your stereotypical sort of movie climax, how the hell do you get those two things in the same movie together? In other words, there is no Virgin years who his later years, right? So it's not like in the first film, they make it so that the Joker killed Batman's parents. Now, that wasn't really, abusing the story. What that let Burton do, villain of the end of the movie, be tied to Batman's origins. So it's not like, okay, here's his origins, then he meets a guy who becomes the villain. So I think that actually working the Ra's al Ghul thing in and changing it, so, it's like League of Assassins, and, there are some changes there. It's less environmentally focused. But I think that is really an ingenious move and Nolan that ties that movie together. And so Batman's able to, in a sense, become Batman in negatively or in negative contrast to Ra's al Ghul and the League of Assassins. And then he's able to form himself as his own man, as Batman, and when Ra's comes back at the end, then this gets to be presented as, hey, I've gone off on my own, I've become my own man in opposition to you and to your training. And so you have this final conflict that is tied to the origin. And it's also tied to who Thomas Wayne was, and how Batman is essentially figuring out who he is in opposition not only to Ra's al Ghul but also to his own father. And so I think that was really the genius move of Batman Begins. And I think that much more than year one, being able to pull together all the Ra's al Ghul stuff, fuse it to the structure of year one, and use the Scarecrow in the Arkham Asylum stuff. So what you get is something that's very tight from a narrative perspective. It's a classic 3-act structure. The villain at the end is there in the beginning. Arkham stuff doesn't have Scarecrow jammed into it like a lot of these movies do these days, where people complain there are too many villains and too much stuff is going on. In total contrast to that, Batman Begins hangs together, and I think it's more because of the Ra's al Ghul stuff than it is because of the year one stuff.
Now, it's kind of interesting that you had mentioned that there's this sort of conflict among other superhero films where you sort of have this frenetic kind of tumultuous arc that has so much going on that it sort of loses focus for the main hero's journey that goes throughout the film. Do you believe, and would you consider treating this in another book? Would you say connect the successes of Batman Begins with some of the challenges that were faced with Dark Knight, in that you have sort of these multiple villains that kind of come up, like Two-Face emerges in essentially within the final act and really only gets a very disproportionately small amount of screen time, as opposed to, say, someone like the Joker, who kind of dominates and becomes this antithesis of Batman. Would you say that Batman Begins is sort of this well-demonstrated model of being able to fit all the right pieces and all the right amount of things into one film, and then you would say have The Dark Knight, where you're starting to see more of the tension and the strain being put on the narrative to kind of fit all these elements together?
Well, I think Dark Knight works. I mean, and here we might have to make the observation that, I mean, Batman Begins is probably a tighter script than Dark Knight. I mean, Dark Knight is 5 acts, and for Dark Knight, Nolan said, just put it all in there, right? I mean, they did not make Dark Knight planning a third part, most of these sequels are done these days, where they'll say, okay, we're setting Phoenix up for the third one or whatever. Nolan was adamant, no, it's all going in the second one. We're not planning for a third. And I think you see that in that, even though it's over 2 hours, it's about 2 hours and 35 minutes or something. It's a long movie, and it's 5 acts. But it's really, really, every minute in Dark Knight is doing multiple things, and you can tell that there are like about 3 movies that are jammed together there. Now, I happen to think it's jammed together really well, and I think it hangs together well because, I mean, you were complaining that Two-Face only really emerges at the very end, and that's absolutely correct. And it's really dominated by Joker, and that's totally correct. However, I would say that they're united by exploring the unintended consequences of Bruce Wayne becoming Batman. So if Batman Begins is wrestling with how do I, as Bruce Wayne, become the man I want to be, with my dead father and with Ra's al Ghul being my mentor, who I have this vital disagreement with. And by the end of that movie, he's become Batman, but it introduces the idea of escalation. The Joker represents escalation. That once you introduce somebody like a Batman into this world of Gotham, you will get a Joker, right? It's not all going to be gangsters anymore. It's not even going to be Ra's al Ghul anymore. It's going to be lunatics like Joker, and some of them are just going to want to watch the world burn. And so Joker represents that element. He represents this idea of escalation, that this is not a controlled environment, that changed the world, or at least changed Gotham. And so you're going to have this. With Harvey Dent, you have the same idea explored, except from a political angle. So everything in that movie is sort of explored. You have the people imitating Batman, who are becoming vigilantes, the sort of like slightly fat Batman, and they get killed by Joker, and they're sort of good for a laugh. But the Harvey Dent is exploring the ramifications of Batman's existence. So Harvey Dent becomes this White Knight in order to clean up Gotham, hopeless before Batman arrived. And Harvey Dent, in becoming the White Knight, is in his own way responding to Batman, right? We have this opening now. We can work with Batman. He's a temporary evil. We can clean up the city. And so Harvey Dent is defined as a character as a response to Batman. and his destruction, which it turns him into Two-Face at the end. It's true we don't get to have Two-Face doing much stuff, and that's kind of a shame. But his destruction is all tied up in this whole web that's been woven throughout that film of the various responses to Batman's existence, whether it's Joker escalating or it's people imitating Batman in a way that he can't control by becoming vigilantes themselves, or it's this creation of this white knight politician, that the politics of Gotham are going to change. And so I do see that as all interwoven. I'm not a big critic of Dark Knight for having thrown too much in. I think it manages to do it well. And I think there's something to be said for whether a movie works, right? I mean, so much of that movie works because of Heath Ledger's performance. And, movie making, as in a lot of parts, but especially movie making because you're capturing stuff live. I mean, you're capturing performances. So much of it depends on whether you get great performances and what's captured by the camera and what comes out in editing. And so, movies sometimes just have that movie magic where you look at them and you say, this is a really stupid script, right? But this works. And I think Dark Knight is probably not as good of a script as Batman Begins, but I think it works probably better as a movie as far as just pulling you in because you're so drawn into this world and Heath Ledger's performance and everything. So it might not be as tight. When I think of movies that have abused this putting too much stuff in, I would think of something like some of the Batman sequels of the Burton stuff, where you get like the Schumacher stuff, and there's no reason for Bane to be in this movie. He's just the third villain. Spider-Man 3 comes to mind, where you have the Sandman story, and the Sandman story is great, but it's a kind of like small-scale story of atoning for my father, and or for Uncle Ben, and it's a very personal story, and that's combined with the Venom story, which does not need to be in the same movie together. I mean, the two villains team up, but those ideas do not need to be together, right? Venom crash landing in a meteor in a park, just does not belong in that story of atonement with, Sandman. Whereas I think that Harvey Dent, representing this political response to Batman, does belong in the same movie with the Joker representing escalation. So I would defend, two villains in that movie. And arguably, you have two villains in the first one, right? I mean, you have Scarecrow and you have Ra's al Ghul, and you also have the mobster, right? So, I mean, theoretically, you have three there. So I think it's more a matter of, do together as a single narrative arc with unified themes, right? Telling a single story that, of course, Harvey Dent was going to be active at the same time as the Joker, right? It's in this period, and you can't separate either of them from that period. It's not just the next adventure, of a character in an episodic way.
Now, for those of us who are in the conversation, if you look in your window, there's a QA icon at the end of our interview with Julian Darius. You can submit questions that we can answer in the last portion of this interview. And we also have some questions that some people have emailed me beforehand that we'll also be taking care of too. But in the meantime, if you'd like, you can also ask questions through the little QA widgets. It's a blue icon with a Q and an A on it. Just click that, and you can submit questions to me and Julian, and we can answer them in the order that they're received. Now, what I think is kind of interesting is, so especially in comic book history, you have, say a period of revisionism, the late 80s dark, gritty superhero films, and then comics, and then you have sort of like mid to late 90s, you have this resurgence of like Reconstructionism, where you have this new wave of comics that are trying to escape this gritty darkness, and even like J.M. DeMatteis does like his Elseworlds bit where he says, is this the kind of hero that we create, and that kind of thing. So as far as Batman Begins is concerned, would you consider this movie, despite it pulling a lot from those revisionism era with like the Frank Miller kind of DIY Batman of hanging up the lights in the cave and that kind of thing, would you pin yeah, would you pin Batman Begins as a revisionist film or a reconstruction or some kind of happy medium of both sort of working together?
No, I think it's clearly a revisionist film. That isn't to say that there's any such thing as a perfect revisionist work, or everything is revisionist in some ways and not in others. Actually, I would say that Burton's first film is clearly a revisionist film too. It's a gothic, movie. It's very dark. Of course, now it's sort of thought of as a kind of gothic fantasy, but you have to understand the public's mentality about Batman was formed by the Adam West TV show, and that was the number one reason why they didn't want to do a Batman movie. And Michael Uzlan and others worked for years to try to get that movie done and get it done in a dark way. They were looking at Batman Year One. They were looking at Killing Joke. They were looking at especially Dark Knight Returns. And Burton's Batman came out of that. So Batman Begins is obviously a much more realistic, darker in a lot of ways, certainly much more realistic depiction, and that was really the buzzword for Nolan was realism. The whole idea, his whole guiding principle for all three of these films was to make them at least as realistic as a James Bond movie, right? Mm-hmm. So when we see a James Bond movie, they still have absurd elements, right? I mean, you have pocket guns and stuff like that, but it's like within the realm of possibility, right? So it's a little fantastic, but it's not like Mr. Freeze covered in ice, right? I mean, it's not like the Penguin ordering penguins around and they're listing, right? Those are just fantastical things that do not belong in the Nolan Batman verse, right? That doesn't mean that revisionism has unrealistic things. I mean, if you look at, are you still there?
Yes, my battery is running low. I'll be right back in 1 second.
Okay, I'll talk. If you look at revisionism, not everything in revisionism is totally realistic. In Dark Knight Returns, for example, you have those sort of flying robots. You have lots of the Joker's poison gas. There's stuff in there that's not totally realistic, and it's not like revisionism was always 100% realistic to the degree that Nolan injected his three films with. But yeah. To answer your question in brief, yeah, I mean, they're absolutely revisionist films. But I think what's interesting here is that, and Zack, I'm not the biggest Zack Snyder fan, but he's right about this, that, I mean, essentially, revisionism came to superhero comics in the 1980s. And, at that time, you had all these comics fans like me going, dude, this is fantastic, right? I mean, this is not just Batman fighting Lex Luthor who's trying to rob a bank with a robot for no known reason, right? I mean, you've got a robot. Why are you robbing a bank for, $500,000 when you've got a robot? What is going on here? I'm being overly simplistic about it, but revisionism came in, and we all looked at stuff like Watchmen, and we said, this is literature, right? I mean, you cannot argue this is not literature. You cannot argue this is not sophisticated. This cannot stand with anything. I mean, at the same time, Will Eisner had been doing his graphic novels, and they got a lot more attention in the 80s. He had been doing them since the late 70s. And there was a real renaissance of this kind of stuff. and obviously year one, Dark Knight Returns came out, and this was a real renaissance of what comics could do. Mouse was coming out at the same time. I mean, it wasn't just superheroes, and so we knew that about comics. The average, American did not know any of this. To them, superheroes were basically child's fare. They were the Superman movies, and that was it, right? And then Howard the Duck. I mean, this was the public face of just campy, silly stuff. And then Burton's Batman came out, and that was great, and made a lot of money. The sequel does okay, and then we get a couple campy Schumacher movies that basically reverts to this public perception, right? So then we get X-Men, we get Spider-Man, we get the kind of Marvel superhero movie making, and during all of that, Nolan's films come out. So really, what I would say is that, I mean, Nolan's films are, and to a lesser extent, all of these superhero movies. Not so much the Marvel Studios films, but certainly to some extent the X-Men films. Certainly Nolan's films. Certainly Man of Steel, even though I'm not a big fan of that. Watchmen. Zack Snyder is clearly a revisionist, and he's not a careful architectural revisionist the way Nolan is, but he is a dark, violent, revisionist, very much on the model of Dark Knight Returns. So what Snyder has said, and I think he's right about this, is that basically superhero movies never got their revisionism, and that really they were still, just as sort of silly as they, superhero comics were basically, in the early 80s. Superhero movies is basically happening now, right? I mean, and it's happening. It happened to some extent with the X-Men films, but it certainly happened with the Nolan films, which are more intelligent, more realistic. It's not happening with the Marvel movies, which are clearly Reconstructionism. You could argue avant le mot, because there's, what are they rebelling against? There's no intelligent superman except for a handful. So what is this return to fun that the Marvel movies are so focused on? What is it arguing against? But Snyder's doing his version of revisionism, whether you like it or not. I think it has big flaws, but he's doing it. And I think the real argument would be that the two media have just progressed differently, and there just really has not been a superhero movies. The closest we've gotten has been Nolan's 3 films, Snyder's Man of Steel. Arguably, you could say Superman Returns is kind of quasi-revisionistic in the sense of Superman having a son and having to deal with those issues, and I think it's a brilliant movie. It's not a particularly dark movie, but it is an intelligent movie about expanding what Superman can be about. So, I mean, you could make these kinds of arguments, but I definitely think the Nolan films are, arch revisionist films.
So as far as improving the foundations goes, is there any particular aspects of the book that you would like to see added on to if there was ever a 3rd edition released for the book?
Well, I got to make updates. I mean, the 2nd edition was a major revision, and I got to make all the updates I wanted to for that. Since this current, which is the revised 2nd edition, came out, it has been revealed who made the map of Gotham that was used in Nolan and No Man's Land. And we did not know that. I searched for that, and that was not publicly available. We now know who did that, and there's been an interview with him. So I'd like to credit him. But outside of that, I mean, we're talking about a book on, Batman Begins, and I don't feel like I left anything out.
Okay.
that's not usually Julian Darius's fault. I mean, it's leaving too much out. I do feel like I would love to write about Dark Knight because I've done all the thinking behind it as far as the 5-act structure and sort of what I've talked about. That kind of the first act is him ends up with him in Hong Kong, and sort of it's a whole movie unto itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really escalates and goes through a kind of classic 5-act structure that I think is woven together quite brilliantly. And I think that's why that ending is so powerful. It's because it pays off all these little references from the whole thing that is just woven like a tapestry. And I think Rises is a terrible failure.
Yeah, I recall reading your treatise on the Dark Knight Rises. It was very bitter is the word. We are actually about 20 minutes from the conclusion of the interview, but I do have some questions that Jason Ferris, one of our valued Patreon members, have forwarded to us. He has 2 questions. The first is, and I'll just select this here. Excellent. Nolan's Batman trilogy has relationship to post 9/11 culture. Could you talk about your feelings on this a little further? Is Nolan attempting to say something specific or using it as aesthetic? Is he trying to have it both ways?
Both ways. But I think it depends what movie you look at. That's a fantastic question, by the way. 9/11 changed the way we made superhero movies. I mean, don't forget that Spider-Man was coming out about that time, and they had that ad with the World Trade Center, with a web between them, and it changed the way we did these movies. I think that effect has kind of died down now, but there's not a whole lot of kind of like urban destruction in Batman Begins. There's the monorail, but the monorail seems less like a 9/11 kind of tragedy, and more it's about Thomas Wayne and kind of Batman destroying this legacy of Thomas Wayne. Now, I mean, Ra's al Ghul is clearly a kind of like Al Qaeda figure, right? I mean, but I think there, it's kind of like Nolan's riffing on it. With Dark Knight, you have the problem of sort of how you deal with terrorism and the NSA nonsense, right? So you have this idea of the sort of phone tapping, and so this device is used that sort of invades people's privacy. And that obviously, was a Patriot Act kind of reference. And fun there, the film clearly suggests that this device is wrong, right? Lucius Fox, who is the conscience of the movie, says this is wrong. You can use it this once, but then you have to destroy it. So in that case, Nolan's kind of playing with it, but he comes off as a kind of not necessarily liberal, but I mean he comes off as somebody who is suspicious of the kind of post 9/11 security state. And I think that in Rises, obviously the effect is completely the opposite. That in Rises, Bane represents the kind of Occupy Wall Street rejection of the culture. We don't need no stinking police, and then you see there's no sort of ideological basis to this. He just wants to nuke the entire city, which seems so manipulative, right? Because I mean, say what you will. I mean, even if you regard Occupy Wall Street as quasi-Stalinist or something, Stalin didn't want to nuke Moscow. I mean, this is totally insane and a very reactionary reactionary thing. And also, it doesn't make any sense because Bane's Gotham is actually super well run, right? I mean, like, there's a little trash on the streets, but I mean, like, it's been like 6 months and it's actually run really well. And I don't know why those police haven't been able to get out of the sewers in 6 months, but
now they're getting fed.
the movie doesn't seem in control. What?
Or how they're getting fed.
Yeah, well, there's kind of the insinuation that somehow they're, I mean, they're kind of like Bane is taking care of even these prisoners. I mean, it's very confusing. And so I think that is an example of Nolan trying to have it both ways, right? I mean, like, even when the Scarecrow says, go out on the ice, right? And, he criticizes Gordon for having created this, the Dent laws, right? The laws passed in the wake of Harvey Dent. Now, those were laws that circumvent basic civil rights. Now, those are probably unconstitutional, and in the real world would have been overturned by the Supreme Court. But I mean, these are terrible laws. You should be upset about them. And in the real world, those kinds of laws have not been shown to actually put more people behind bars who are serious terrorists anyway. And so, but Nolan doesn't want to get into that. There were lines like that in the script, but they were edited out for the final movie. And Nolan doesn't want to get into that because he doesn't want to. He didn't want it to be this political movie. He didn't want it to be that kind of thing. And I think the end result is he wanted it to just be more action-packed and entertaining and riff on these ideas without making a statement. But you're making a statement whether you know it or are in charge of it or in control of it or not. So I think that Nolan does have it both ways. And he uses the post-9/11 security state and post-9/11 fears to generate narrative grist and excitement. And the ways in which he does vary from movie to movie, as does the relative level of success that he has.
Jason Ferris also has a second question for us as well. Let's see here. There we are.
I'll try to be quicker.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'll actually piggyback off of Jason if we have time. His next question is, what are your feelings on corporate intellectual properties being at the center of mainstream or popular myth-making?
Well, my feelings are conflicted. I came up as a kid in the 80s, right? And I mean, we liked He-Man, and I love Transformers, and G.I. Joe, and I mean, these were corporate intellectual properties, and we argued over DC versus Marvel, and I've been thinking recently about I grew up partially in California, and I was really loyal to Knott's Berry Farm because they had a deal with Snoopy, and I love Snoopy, and I could go to an amusement and Snoopy souvenirs, right? Now, that was a corporate thing, and I was loyal to Knott's Berry Farm over Disneyland specifically because I liked Snoopy and thought Snoopy had character and things to say, and Mickey Mouse did not, and Mickey Mouse did not appeal to me. So, I mean, I guess I would say this has kind of been going on forever. Even like in the newspaper comics days, the syndicates owned those strips. So, and the movie studios owned, the movies and always have. So I don't know that this is new. It's just that the level of commercialization, the level of toys and T-shirts and total saturation, and video games, it seems new. We had toys growing up that we were in cartoon shows and the movie theaters, but it does seem like there's a level of saturation now that is beyond the furor of the '66 Batman show or the '89 Burton Batman movie. it does seem like there's a level of saturation that's disturbing. But I mean, it may be that only corporations are able to get these products out enough that they get into our dreamscapes. I mean, my feeling is kind of like, okay, well, this is the way it is. It's probably always going to be that way because you need to get into people's dreamscapes to have people go like, no, I'm loyal to Pepsi. Years. Well, you have no skin in this game. I am bothered by the fact that there are a lot of independent comics and a lot of independent movies that certainly are better quality and certainly are far more deserving of this kind of attention and loyalty, but don't get it because they don't have $50 million in marketing money behind it, which is what ultimately ends up getting kids in the pajamas. So I'm bothered by it, but I don't know that it's new.
Yeah, I've actually I recall when I saw Man of Steel, or at least a trailer before advertising Man of Steel, and they had their National Guard campaign. So in no sense, it was kind of this weird military-industrial complex, sort of using this popular culture as kind of propaganda, which, going back to like the original Action Comics days when Superman was fighting Hitler, I guess a lot of not POWs, a lot of GIs were sort of got jaded because they felt like superheroes were fighting the battles for them, and they weren't actually fighting for American interests. So I thought it was interesting that there's sort of this cyclical history where we're now using superheroes again to sort of market aspects of our armed forces and everything.
Yeah, that was a very bizarre campaign, and I thought it was in poor taste. That campaign might have been able to succeed right after 9/11. When kind of we were in a very jingoistic mode. But I mean, Superman has always, not always, but I mean, traditionally stood for justice and the American way. But that has often been in opposition to his government. And the idea of sort of using Superman to promote the National Guard, which of course is, we all know the history of the National Guard being sent to Iraq as combat troops repeatedly, especially during the Bush years, in a way that they certainly didn't sign up for. To sort of pretend that Superman could endorse the National Guard comfortably, I think is very bizarre. But, moves change. And I'm not sure that they would run that ad today.
Jason has sort of changed the dynamic of this question. This will be the last question we'll answer. But in the same sense, what are your feelings on corporate intellectual properties being at the center of mainstream and popular myth-making? What are your feelings on these kinds of properties being of Sequart's attention?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm answering these questions as a writer and as an intellectual, but I also have to put on, my other hat, which is sort of founder, somebody who continues to exercise a kind of editorial control over Sequart's production. So I think these corporate intellectual properties merit attention. I think that because I can't go over to the houses of any one of my friends who has kids and not see them in I buy them these T-shirts for Christmas with Supergirl and stuff like that. But they all love Captain America and Iron Man, and I think these are Johnny-come-lately, to the movie scenes. But you can't argue that this stuff is not worth discussing and not worth analyzing. On the flip side, the stuff that has influenced me has been much more French comics independent comics, and a lot of that stuff is stuff that maybe a book about it doesn't have an audience. Now, fortunately at Sequart, we don't have to make decisions based on that. We can just publish what we want to publish. We have a nonprofit perspective, and so we do what we want to do, and damn the torpedoes, right? I mean, if the book should exist, we can make it exist. But I always does too much of the mainstream stuff. Not enough of the independent stuff. Definitely not enough manga. Not enough French stuff. Not enough international stuff. I mean, I feel that very strongly. But the question is, who's going to write that book? I mean, the last book we published in January was Jeff Klock's book on Casanova by Matt Fraction. Now, that's an independent comic. I mean, that's from Image. It's not the most obscure thing in the world, but it's not a mainstream Big Two kind of thing. But as far as Sequart's output, I'm always open to that criticism, and some of that is criticism that I share. And all I can say is that if you disagree and you want more of this other content, find people to write for us, because we'll be glad to publish it, and we believe we need to do a better job of that too.
Yeah, and I would also agree and piggyback off of that as well, saying that comic books is sort of like this modern American mythology, at least in the perspective of DC and Marvel, where no one lives in a vacuum. Everyone is influenced by some kind of culture. I'm Christian, for instance, so I'm influenced by Christian culture, but I'm also an American, so I'm influenced by American culture, and I'm a Californian, so I'm influenced by Californian culture. So one thing I've really always appreciated about Sequart is our ability to have an international staff, to have writers from Britain or writers from India or writers from the European continental Europe, and being able to reach into these different worldviews and perspectives that they live in, that allow us to have this very broad kind of international focus on comics. Especially in the case of Matt Fraction's comic as well.
And second, no ideological bias. I mean, this was something that, like, I used to read the Comics Journal back in its heyday. I really liked it, but it definitely became very quickly focused on sort of black and white independent comics, and didn't do enough coverage of the mainstream. And at Wizard, it was only the Big Two, right? So, Sequart adamantly believes that the medium of comics matters, and that glory of the medium of comics and what needs to be discussed there is not limited to superheroes. It's not limited to the Big Two, but it also should not exclude the Big Two. It's not limited to America. It's not limited to any one genre, but it should not exclude anyone or anybody's point of view. I think that's a very purist attitude toward the medium, and that it's worth discussing in all of its permutations.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we are done. Our time is up. It's been a pleasure having you with us today, Julian, and talking about your book, Improving the Foundations. Is there any concluding thoughts?
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I just want to say thanks so much for doing this, and thank you to our patrons. This has been your response has been wonderful and encouraging. We've been at this game as far as publishing books and analyzing comics for a long time, as you know, and your support has meant the world to us and really touches us. We are always very conscious of the fact that we all work for our money, and when you put your money behind something and say that it's worthwhile and it means something to you and you want it to exist and grow, that's a to all of us at Sequart. So I just wanted to say thank you to the patrons, and thank you for hosting this, Stuart.
Absolutely. And Jason's concluding remark is thanks to you, Julian, and for everything that we do. Um,
Thank you,
I
Jason.
think and also just to the to our Sequart patrons, apologies for any technical difficulties that we had to endure in the beginning of the Hangout. I think this has gone really well, and I look forward to doing other ones. And thank you, Julian, again for being with us today. And I wish you all the best of your day.
Thank you.
All right. See you guys later.